So for this session, we're going to look at the work of Max Weber, German sociologist, as an example of somebody using their sociological imagination. Although Weber is alive at the same time as Durkheim, um, Weber is much more influenced by the work of Karl Marx. The work of Karl Marx, who come about a half a century earlier, was or 30 years earlier anyway, was sort of propagating its way through European society at the time that Weber was doing his work. And while the two theorists have a lot in common, there are some important distinctions. Weber focused a little bit more on the role of rationality, what we call formal rationality as a form of thinking, and the impact that that had on society, but also, of course, the impact of society on the kind of thinking that people engaged in. Um, Weber was, like these other two theorists, was very interested in the impact of industrialization on European society. He was concerned about the growing dominance of formal rationality, which is a kind of thinking that I'll describe in just a few minutes. And also felt like culture could exert a particularly significant shaping influence on the rest of society. This is a little bit at odds with what Marx was arguing, which was that the economic underlying structure would shape everything that kind of rested on that foundation, on that base, and that would include the culture. And Weber's coming along at the end of the 1800s and the very beginning of the 1900s and saying, that in fact sometimes it's culture that's going to drive and shape the underlying economic system, sort of turning Marx's argument around on its head. So again, somebody who probably has more in common with Marx than what sets him apart in many regards, but some important and very interesting sort of distinctions, and somebody who recognize that sort of paradoxical nature of culture that I mentioned back toward the beginning of the semester. So you will come across the ideas of Weber a little bit later. I know it's spelled with the W, but it's German, so it's pronounced B sound. So Max Weber's ideas are going to be sort of explored again in the context of the piece that you're going to read by George Ritzer a little bit later this semester, so I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but I just want to point out the degree to which he saw the impact of industrialization on even the fundamental forms of thought that people engaged in. So Weber makes an argument that everybody engages in what he calls rational behavior. Rational behavior is just calculating behavior, one in which you are looking for the most efficient means to a given end, costs and benefits that occur. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, Weber makes an argument that most people engage in what's called substantive rationality. Now, substantive rationality is still calculating behavior, but it's one in which you're looking for efficiency while being sensitive to the needs of your community and the values of your community. And this makes a lot of sense because prior to the Industrial Revolution, you were going to spend your whole life, in all likelihood, in some small town or village in the European countryside, right? So if you were a person who had a reputation for engaging in calculating behavior that benefited only you at the expense of your neighbors, your everyday life was going to be probably pretty uncomfortable. So before people became strangers, before people engaged in kind of a naked calculating kind of behavior that they can get away with because people around them are strangers, Weber's making an argument that people do the cost-benefit analysis with a very broad set of considerations of cost to me and my community, benefit to me and my community. And what changes, of course, is the nature of where we live and the people we share communities with, right? So the Industrial Revolution comes along, modernity comes along, everything is fundamentally upended and changed, And as a result of that now, the places where people lived in European society tended to be large, heterogeneous, composed of people who were strangers to one another in many regards. Um, and rationality over time shifts from a kind of substantive rationality to what we call formal rationality. Formal rationality is calculating behavior in which your decisions are based solely on the financial benefit to you and the financial cost to you, right? So the concerns and the scope of the considerations narrow, but also increasingly the criteria for what makes a choice rational or not is calculated in actual financial and monetary costs. Um, and as a result of that, of course, you have a different set of values driving society. The things that come to be valued, the things that come to be important in that society, are going to be things that reflect outcomes that can be generated through the application of formal rationality. And for Weber, the perfect model for that was bureaucracy, right? The idea of an organizational structure that was designed to maximize efficiency by, in essence, minimizing the degree to which human relations and a consideration of anything other than sort of the bottom line, um, was kind of at work in driving decision making and in driving human action. The other contribution, as I said, is that this guy makes is one in which he considers that the relationship between culture and structure, as described by Marx, in a fundamentally different way. He postulates, he suggests that in the emergence of capitalism, uh, the one of the key variables was whether a society was sort of ideologically primed for for this new emerging economic systems. Capitalism as an economic system emerges in the 1600s, right? Very incrementally, but little by little, over the course of the 1600s, this new system emerges. It replaces or begins to significantly replace feudalism, the system of kings and monarchs and stuff that was in place for the vast majority of the time between the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of modern nation states. And there are a number of critical variables that go into sort of shaping the emergence of this, and without turning this into too much of a history lesson, which is kind of one of my um, unfortunate tendencies. Sometimes I like to dive into the history. Um, Capitalism emerges more quickly in places like Germany and England than it does in places like France. And for Weber, the explanation for that, remember, because all of these guys are using their sociological imagination, they all want to see the way in which the society around them um, has come to be organized the way it's come to be organized, right? Their assumption is that something larger than just the individual actions of the people in the society are responsible for this. Um, Weber argues that Protestant values, what he would call a Protestant ethic, was kind of consistent with um, a broad set of ethics within capitalism. Really tricky that you don't misunderstand this. He isn't saying that Protestantism is the same as capitalism. He's saying that Protestantism, as a practice, as a kind of religious practice, um, has a number of features which become sort of deeply held cultural values and beliefs that are really critical to people who practice that particular kind of faith. Um, Capitalism has a set of ethical um, uh, values and some practical behavioral consequences of those values that are kind of consistent with that. So he writes a book in 1905 called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which he argues that countries that had already kind of embraced a certain set of values, a certain set of ethical practices, um, were kind of primed to not resist, at the very least, and in many cases, sort of outright embrace those same ethical principles when they were embedded within the context of an economic system. And to understand that, again, I'm going to give you just a really, really short Cliff's Notes version of this. Weber is arguing that Calvin, Protestantism, specifically Calvinism and Pietism, what we would think of today as like the Puritans, right? The Puritans who came and settled Plymouth Colony in the 1620s, they were very much informed by this particular kind of Protestant tradition. Protestantism dates back to 1517. The shift sentiment against the Catholic Church, which was the dominant religion in Europe at the time, took the form of a protest, which is where we get Protestant, protesting the perceived corruption of the Catholic Church. The proliferation of traditions within Protestant faith led to some very interesting sort of groups, right? So you had the Lutherans and the Wesleyans and the Baptists and the Calvinists and the Pietists, right? So all of these different sects or splits or derivations from the original protest started by Martin Luther in 1517. So a couple of things that are true of Puritan values or Pietist and Calvinist values. First, work is seen as what was called a calling. So the thing you have to understand about the way that these people saw the world is that everything in the world is a reflection of a plan, and specifically of God's plan. The world is the way it is because God has ordered it thus. And in this worldview, everyone has a place. Everyone has a part to play in God's plan. So the thing that you are meant to do, the work that you are meant to pursue in your life, isn't so much a career or a preference or a passion. It's what God intends you to be doing. It is your calling. So work is seen as something that you pour every bit of your essence into. And the reason you do this, of course, is because success in your calling is going to be the measure of the degree to which you are predestined for salvation. So predestination is a really, really important part of some of these early Protestant traditions. The idea is that God knows everything. God is omniscient, and if God knows everything, that means your salvation. Right? And that's a done deal. Right? Whether you're going to heaven or hell is already known by God, and there's nothing that you're going to do to change that. This is very, very different than the dominant mode of thought in Catholicism, which was that the way you get into heaven is you earn your salvation through your works, right? So it's not a done deal. You participate in the sacraments, you do what God intends you to be doing on earth, and at that time when you die, then a judgment is made, and you go to heaven or you don't. So the Pietists and the Calvinists, they're like, no, that's not the way this works, right? God knows everything, and that includes whether or not you're going to heaven or whether you're going to hell. So there's nothing you can do as a person to change God's will, right? So all you can do is hope to recognize which path, God has laid out for you. And the for a variety of reasons, again, without turning this into a seminar on theology, for a variety of reasons they discover or decide, I should say, that success will be sort of taken as a sign that you are among the elect. That's what they would call the people who are predestined for salvation. So you believe in salvation. You believe that success in your calling is going to be the indication of whether or not you're among the elect. All you need to do then is find what God wants you to be doing and then work your ass off at it. And not surprisingly, of course, a byproduct of hard work in one's avocation, one's one's job is often going to be success. And here's where another feature of this particular kind of Protestantism comes into play. These pietists, these Calvinists, practice what's called an ascetic Protestantism, which means a non-materialistic sort of life. Right? That you make this money, which is your success in your calling, but you're not allowed to spend it on yourself, right? Living an indulgent lifestyle with fancy clothes and a big house, that's worldly, right? And you're supposed to be above such things. You are also not supposed to give your money to charity because helping poor people prevents them from going out and finding their own calling. So you're really not helping them by providing charity. Um, you don't spend very much money on churches, right? It's the Catholics who have the big fancy churches, right? The Protestant churches, if they have churches at all, are very, very humble, small buildings, and very modest structures. Most Protestant worship services happen inside people's homes, right? This isn't a big lavish sort of religious practice like Catholicism in the 1500s was. Um, so you can't really hoard the money, you can't really spend the money, you can't really give the money away, you can't build big fancy churches, but you're making a lot of money. And it turns out that the only thing you can really do with this money is to turn around and recapitalize it, to reinvest it back in your calling, right? So if you have a small business and you are successful, you take that money and you put it back into your business. The business grows, and you're a little more successful, and you take that money and put it back in your business because you can't do anything else with it, and on and on and on. And this is why these people, I think, look so miserable, right? They know they're going to heaven because they're successful, but they also don't like the idea of having to constantly sort of find ways to kind of get this money back into their business. Like, can this please all just be over? I'm kind of joking. That's definitely not, or in all likelihood, not what they were thinking. But the point here is you've got a set of behavioral practices that are not tied to making money. They're not tied to greed or avarice or a desire to have things, but things like thrift and hard work and recapitalization and all of that, which is part of the Protestant ethic, lines up very nicely with the kinds of behaviors that are going to facilitate the emergence of capitalism, right? Hard work, taking money and investing it back into your business, not wasting time, not wasting opportunity, not wasting anything, right? Being incredibly efficient, being incredibly frugal. I think if you want a really good example of that kind of pietist or Puritan sort of thinking in a kind of somewhat more modern context, you can read like all of the advice of like Benjamin Franklin. Right? When Benjamin Franklin was writing stuff in Poor Richard's Almanac and things like that in the 1700s, um, a lot of his aphorisms are kind of a reflection of that underlying um, Puritan or Protestant ideology, but here specifically kind of applied to how one should conduct themselves with regard to their business affairs. So if you get up early and you start working an hour before your competitor, then that you're always going to be ahead because that competitor is never going to be able to go back in time and start working at the same time that you did, right? Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man wealthy, healthy, and wise. Right? All of that stuff, right? A penny saved is a penny earned. All of those kinds of things that Ben Franklin was writing about back in the 1700s was, I think, kind of a very nice reflection of that. So Weber's argument in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism is essentially that capitalism emerges in part because cultural conditions in particular countries, specifically in Protestant countries, had sort of paved the way. They made the public more receptive to the kinds of things that were specific to the ethical practices and the value system of capitalism, which is, again, a kind of an inversion of the argument that Marx is making. Marx is arguing that at the end of the day, the underlying economic system is going to shape the cultural values. And Weber comes along and says, yeah, but here's a situation in which it's possible that the cultural values shape the emergence of the economic system. So a kind of interesting sort of debate with the ideas of this guy, who had preceded him in the 30 or 4 years before he kind of really got started doing his thing. Um, so again, the thing that I want you guys to take away from this is the way that Weber is once again seeing connections between larger sort of social level phenomena, in this case culture, and creating linkages to other sort of social and structural features, specifically the particular form that a society's economic system is going to take. And again, this is a really good example of somebody using their sociological imagination. All right, so next time, a very quick sort of overview of theoretical paradigms. I promise that one will be nice and short. And then we'll talk a little bit about critical thinking and some of the other features of science as both or sociology as both a science and a sort of philosophical pursuit on some level. At the very least, a way of thinking. All right, so until then, have a good one.